All right, well, welcome to Questioning Christianity, the channel that really does try and help you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. And this episode of our live stream is going to be devoted to explaining the problem of evil. This is one of the longest challenges to the Christian faith. It's the most enduring criticism, and it's a very personal question for so many people who are going to be watching this. Because it's so deep and so challenging and way beyond my ken, I've invited in the big guns. We are calling as some good friends all the way over at Oxford University, where Dominus Illuminatio Mea, the Lord is their light. And we're going to hope that they shed some of that light on this question, which has been profound and really provoked both doubts for believers and real questions and barriers to belief in Christianity for those who experience suffering and evil in the world. So I'm going to welcome on now a couple of guests. This is Max Baker-Hytch, a pro-philosopher. It kind of means he's a big nerd, and we're really thankful for it. And also Daniel or Dan Woolnough, and the two of them are both writing a book at the moment. We're going to give them a chance just to quickly introduce themselves, a quick bit about their story before we dive into talking about the problem of evil. Dan, since you are first, it's first time on the channel. Max has been on a couple of times before. We might kick off with you. Just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you get up to.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much for having me on. It's a real pleasure to be here and to share the very small amount of wisdom I'm sure that I in fact have on the topic. So yeah, I'm Dan. I live in Oxford with my wife and my son Micah, who's 3, and a daughter who is due to be born in August. In fact, she's at full term at the moment, so at any point from now. So I'm a DPhil candidate. That's a PhD at Oxford, and I work, broadly speaking, in the philosophy of religion, and in particular I work on the problem of evil and theodicy. That's me. And it's
we're glad to have you on, and that you're a dad of young children means you are the real world philosopher, because they tend to ask the most difficult questions to answer, particularly trying to get it across to young minds. So Max, do you want to give an introduction for anyone that hasn't seen you on our channel before?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, so like Dan, I also live in Oxford with my family, have 2 girls and am married. So I did my DPhil, that's Oxford Speak for PhD in philosophy a few years ago in epistemology and philosophy of religion. I have been over in the States, had a postdoc at University of Notre Dame, and now for the last 7 years have been a lecturer in philosophy at Wycliffe Hall at Oxford University, teaching and researching in philosophy of religion. As you mentioned, Dan and I are working on an academic book broadly in philosophy of religion.
Great. And Max, you've been on before talking about divine hiddenness, which is another big question that I'm sure we'll have to do one of these sort of deep dives on into the future again. But let me introduce the kind of topic at hand, because I know a lot of people have looked forward to being able to think deeply about this question. The problem of evil is the language that it's often given in philosophy of religion, but for most people at the everyday level, it's just going to be, man, if God's real, if he loves us, why would he let all of this bad stuff happen? And that was a really live question for me personally. I actually grew up with Christian parents and was told about God and taken along to Sunday school, and you hear about Jesus and all of these nice things that the Bible tells us about the love of God. But when I was just 9, we were on a family holiday. We drove from Brisbane, which is on the east coast of Australia, about 20 hours down south to my home city of Melbourne. And on the return journey, while passing through a mountain range in thick fog, we had a very serious car accident where my mum headbutted a truck at high speed. She was significantly injured from that car accident. In fact, I think I've got a photo here of sort of the leftovers of our 1980s Tarago van. She was sitting in the front left passenger seat and was collected from behind by a car fridge that hurtled forward upon impact, her legs being crushed in the wreckage. Now, my mum survived that accident, but was airlifted to hospital where she had to be fixed up in a lot of ways. But the biggest area of injury for her were the head injuries, where they removed a third of her skull just so that she wouldn't die from intracranial pressure. And afterwards, the surgeon just said to my dad, look, the brain damage is extensive. If she does survive the next 24 hours, it's likely that the person you know is going to be very changed. And so this experience torpedoed our sort of normal family life in my early childhood. And for me, it was that trigger of not being able to make sense of when people speak about a God who loves us and has a wonderful plan for our life, and then events like this happen. God could have stopped it, but he didn't. And then you zoom out from our own personal stories of tragedy and suffering, and you look at the world around us, and certainly it often seems like the scale and magnitude of suffering that's out there. I mean, we've got natural disasters, we've got diseases, we've got warfare and genocide and greed, and it just does not seem like, to many people at face value, the kind of world that an all-powerful and an all-loving God would make. Certainly these two guys, Dan and Max, would be familiar with Epicurus. He seems to be the father of the problem of evil, in that we can trace back through the Greek writer Lactantius that this argument is penned by him as an argument against the Greek vision of the gods. But it sort of draws in a criticism that if the gods are powerful and if the gods are meant to be benevolent or loving towards us, surely this world should be one without evil. And Epicurus's challenge is reframed by David Hume, but it seems to be, if God can stop suffering, why doesn't he? Surely if he loves us, he would want to. And so if he's neither willing nor able to stop suffering, should he really believe in God? And if he's neither able nor willing, then ultimately it just doesn't seem to earn our trust. This isn't someone that's worth worshipping. Now, there are various dimensions to the problem of evil, and I'm going to pull in these guys now to be able to help give some definitions and distinctions, because the truth is it's not just one problem of evil. There are multiple versions of the problem of evil, certainly in the philosophical literature, but also at the kind of popular level. You've got the logical problem of evil, which is sort of the one we'll dive in, the evidential problem of evil, and the emotional problem of evil. So Max, I might throw it over to you if that's okay. Let's dive into this first dimension of the problem first, the logical problem of evil. And that meme that I just shared, or the picture of Epicurus that people often see online, David Hume really reformulated his argument into taking aim at the Christian view of God, setting it as an eternal criticism of sort of Christian theism and certain beliefs in the attributes of God. Do you want to spell out this logical problem of evil for us?
Yeah, I mean, it trades on the idea that there's two particular properties that the God of classical theism has that seem to be in tension with the existence of evil. Those two properties being the property of being omnipotent, all-powerful, and the property of being omnibenevolent, all good. And so you kind of have to spell those out a little bit in order to see that the tension is there, although maybe it's intuitive already. But the idea is roughly that if God is all good, then God wouldn't want there to be evil. And then you put that together with his being all powerful, so then he has the power to stop there being any evil. Those two things put together, the thought is, yield the prediction that there would be no evil if God exists, but of course there is evil, and so it looks like you've got a tension, to put it mildly, if not an outright logical contradiction.
Yeah, and certainly this version of the argument is framed, and this is going to stretch some people. So today, given that this is a really personal problem for a lot of people, in that why would a good God let bad things happen? Some of the things that we're going to share, you're like, wow, this seems abstract and philosophical, but it will be helpful as we wander through all of it to see what resources the Christian story brings to bear. And anyway, this version of the argument, the reason I bring that up is this is what we would call a deductive argument, meaning it works from the premises to a stated conclusion that yields a total result. And so the logic goes, if an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God exists, then evil should not exist, but evil does exist, therefore that kind of God does not exist. So it seems to say that God's existence is impossible given what we see. That's a deductive version of the argument. Maybe this is maybe the best way to challenge that, because there is other ways of shaping the argument, and because certain Christian responses will respond to the logical version, others will have to go to this next one, because this is a thing from Marilyn McCord Adams back in 1999. She wrote a book called Horrendous Evils and the Goodness of God, to try and give voice to the idea that maybe some of the Christian answers or responses to the problem of evil that David Hume sets out can say, well, maybe God has some reasons, but when you actually look at the kind of suffering that people experience and the terrible dimensions of it, the horrendous nature, the scope of it, it just doesn't seem probable that God exists. And so it shifts from impossible to kind of a probability view. And so her view of this horrendous evils would be that there are these prima facie reasons or horrors or experiences of evil and suffering that seem to destroy any chance of there being some positive meaning to one's life. And I mean, we don't need to go very hard in our imagination to consider what those might be, given the evils that we actually have heard about playing out around the world. And so this actually then leads to a different version of the argument, given that there are these horrendous evils in the world, the kind of evils that make it very, very difficult to see them being compatible with a loving God. It raises a different way of framing it. So Dan, did you want to maybe jump through William Rowe's evidential version of the argument and how that is framed in light of these kinds of horrendous evils?
Sure. Yeah, so if logical, I don't really like the label logical version of the problem of evil, in particular because it's not clear what's so logical about it outside of its structure being in some sense deductive, but you can frame most arguments deductively and it wouldn't yield a kind of logical version. I think the right kind of language to speak about it is these impossibility arguments or inconsistency arguments. I think that's what's really in view here. And the evidential problem of evil is an attempt by Rowe and others to move out of us being committed to the premises being true with a probability of 1, which is what you need in order for it to be impossible that God exists. You need it to be the case that you have kind of certainty with the premises in order for the deduction to follow. Otherwise, the deduction follows by some level of probability, but now it doesn't follow necessarily in the same kind of way. Evidential problem a la Rowe is going to pick out a particular property of kinds of evil. So it seems quite easy, at least for most people, to think evil in general, just any evil, a la you mentioned Hume, but Mackey is known for this argument. And it seems quite weird to think that God could never permit any evil at all. And so the thought is, okay, well, maybe there is a class of evil. This is what you just touched on, the kind of horrors or something like that, that is more specific than the broader class of all evils, just a kind of subset of evils. That's incompatible. And so Rowe uses this language of gratuitous evils. One kind of more intuitive way of thinking about it is pointlessness, but he has a very specific meaning when he talks about gratuitous evils. But for now, let's just think about it this way: an evil that is such that God didn't need it to bring about some other good or something like that. Now, that's a very crude gloss on it, so I'm being very quick here. We can talk about it in more detail, but precisely what gratuitous means for Rowe. But think about it this way: okay, pointless evils are going to be incompatible with theism. Now we have a problem for Rowe, because Rowe can't get the ease of reading off the world that evil exists, or that pointless evil exists, in the same way that you can for evil. Quite easy to see evil, pointless evil. Now we're asking for quite a complex machinery. So instead, Rowe trades on this notion of things appear to be that way. And that gives me evidence. So now we're not talking about a kind of entailment relation. We're thinking about giving me evidence or being justified in believing that there is pointless evil. And so Rowe moves from it appears to be the case that there is pointless evil. And so if it appears to me that there is pointless evil, then there probably is pointless evil. And then I try to run the kind of argument deductively from there. But notice that we're now trading less so much on the kind of premises being 1, not as if Mackey, I think, ever got that easily, but rather now with introducing a notion of probability or plausibility or something like that, that moves us away from the so-called logical version. But really what it's doing is we're saying the set may not be obviously inconsistent in the way that Mackey or Hume wants it to be. But nonetheless, we have a rationality or a kind of justification problem or an evidence problem, hence evidential problem of evil.
I like that. And even your language before about the first way it's framed is an impossibility. You know, if some evil exists, God cannot exist. This one is trying to say if a certain kind of pointless evil exists, and that's probably means that God doesn't exist. So it shifts from impossibility to improbability. which is maybe a helpful way just of distinguishing between these two. And both of them have a certain ease. One is easier to show, you know, that evil exists. This one might be easier just to think. There are certain things that when you hear that they happened, you just go, how can God let something like that happen? Sure, I can understand that maybe he wants me to stub my toe because that may lead to me learning to better navigate the world. But when certain things happen, it just seems so wrong and destroying of anything good in someone's life. You cannot imagine that God could have some kind of reason for that. So and then the third, I guess, kind of part of the problem of evil, those two would really be intellectually framed ways of coming at it. For a lot of people, it's a lot more intuitive. And again, these labels are often just given to it. I'm using it for ease of how people mostly access this conversation. But the emotional problem of evil is what most of us experience when we go through dark nights of the soul, where you lose someone you love, or tragedy strikes, or you just get overwhelmed one day as you're scrolling through the global news feed. You see the scope of suffering in the world, and you just think, oh, man, how can I believe that God really is good? How can I trust that God loves me when he's letting things play out in this way? This wouldn't be, if I had God's powers, how I would Bruce Almighty it or Evan Almighty it. This just feels wrong. And it's those deep existential cries of I can't see God in this in any way, and it's disorienting. And so that would be more of what my experience was in my late childhood and then teenage years, of just saying I can't see how God could bring something good from this. Where is God? He seems distant or hidden. I just don't experience or feel that like he loves us if he's going to let these things play out. And this would be something you hear all throughout the Bible's story, actually. It's not like scripture is trying to filter out any unbecoming reality when it comes to evil and suffering. It's raw and it's honest. And on so many of the major players, King David, right throughout the Psalms, he actually is the one who pens Psalm 22, the words that Jesus quotes on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? But many of the Old Testament prophets and New Testament apostles give voice to that. And so you've got these big kind of question marks of just around, all right, God, it makes me not able to trust that you're there and that you care. And so it's the questions that we'll have to dive into for a lot of people watching this as well, around, all right, what resources then does the Christian story have to respond to these kinds of problems, with the intellectual versions, the impossibility and probability arguments, but then also to speak to more of the human elements of us? Can we really lean in and trust a God who lets us suffer? Now, there are some further distinctions that are helpful to make, I think, in this. Max, do you want to speak to just the ideas within the philosophical literature around moral and natural evils?
Sure, yes. So roughly the idea is moral evils are evils that are brought about by, broadly speaking, agents with moral awareness. And natural evils are those evils that are not, or at least are not, the result of the actions of finite agents. So yeah, I mean, moral evils would sort of paradigmatically include things like murder, genocide, theft, and so on. Natural evils would include also the whole kind of range of things like diseases, natural disasters, earthquakes, etc. Of course, it's possible to have instances of evils that are sort of hard to place cleanly in one or other category. An example that sometimes gets discussed is that of sort of certain kinds of natural disasters seem like they're exacerbated by human activity. Economic factors that you could argue are the result of sort of human malice to some degree, result in people's homes being built in places where they're much more vulnerable to being destroyed by earthquakes. And so it looks like there are some instances of evil that are not able to be cleanly placed in one or other category.
Yeah. Like the categories bleed into each other a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And so again, certain kinds of explanations that Christians might seek to offer will speak to one of these or the other, or potentially both as well. But it's just helpful to get all of this on the table before we start exploring what is the range of Christian responses. And then this is just representative, I guess, of the different kinds of people who will experience evils and suffering in the world. And so from those people who in the literature would be considered cognitively normal or cognitively functioning adults, then you would have children and maybe cognitively impaired adults, and then non-human animals. And the question is, what kind of ability does each of the various explanations have to offer justifying reasons why God might allow different groups of beings to experience evil and suffering in the world? Which, when we try and bring all of that distinction together, this might be useful for you if you've ever tried to wrestle with this problem in a deep way, to kind of look at, okay, the different sources of suffering. There are the moral evils, which arise from free creaturely choices, and then the natural evils, which don't seem to arrive. Oh, I've miswritten that, sorry. Don't seem to arrive from free creaturely choices, but then the different kinds of sufferers, those three categories we just mentioned, and then the kinds of suffering, those ones that don't seem to be horrendous. We can imagine some potential reasons why God might allow that sort of suffering. But then those horrendous ones, the ones that at least appear to be pointless, like there could be no greater good that is brought out of them for either the individual going through it or for the community watching on. So those is kind of the challenge, and we wanted to spend the first 20 minutes just setting this up, because it's a serious problem that can't be simply brushed aside or pretend like we have an easy answer in that regard, which is why when it comes to how Christians have responded in the past, there actually is a range of confidence that Christian thinkers will have when it comes to trying to offer some kind of explanation or response to the problem of evil. Maybe Dan and Max, both of you, I'll let you just speak to this a little bit, because this is a continuum. One end, and we haven't defined all these terms yet, but we'll kind of move towards a radical skeptical theism, which is a view that we don't really know what God's reasons are for allowing, but we probably shouldn't expect to either, right up to a highly ambitious theodicy coming from the sort of two words put together, theodicy, or the justification of God, the righteous vindication of God. So does God have good reasons for allowing these things, and we can know what they are? What would you guys say about where you fall on this spectrum? Do you feel like we have some window into them? Do you feel like actually we have no idea of the mind of God? It's too far beyond us. We just actually have really, 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 really good ones. I think we can make sense of most suffering. It'd be great to see sort of plot yourself on here.
Sure. Yeah, I'm actually working. I'm currently working on something that's related to this, namely about whether or not theodicies and skeptical theism are in fact incompatible. So in fact, I'm not positive that there is in fact a continuum quite like this. I mean, there's definitely going to be incompatibility between saying I know God's exact reason for permitting this instance of evil here, and I have no reason to think that I would know God's reason for permitting that precisely evil. That is incompatible. But based upon this kind of continuum, I effectively think that we won't know God's precise reasons for permitting evils of the various kinds and quantities there are in the world. But we can nonetheless give some plausible reasons. So I would fall just to the right-hand side of this, the kind of the third option along. Sorry. Yeah. But nonetheless,
so that we have some plausible ideas about why God might allow general, but don't seem to know too much about the specific instances of evil.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. Yeah.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Dan. And I actually really appreciate that. I mean, if I was speaking on this personally, my real shorthand is, look, I think drawing from the results of the Christian story, we have some answers, but also it cautions us not to expect to have all the answers, but we have someone we can trust. And that's kind of like my shorthand response right here at the beginning. So I kind of resonate with that. I don't think they're incompatible in that broader sense. Yeah. What about you, Max?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I think I'm probably somewhere around the middle, but maybe a bit to the left of the center. So I think we have the vaguest broad outlines of some possible reasons, but I'd be hesitant to go any further than that.
Yeah, yeah. Which is interesting, because I think a lot of people watching this will maybe, if they're skeptical and say the problem of evil absolutely destroys Christianity and Christians are always overconfidently trying to say they can explain it. And then you often get to professional philosophers who are Christians and really do believe in God and in Jesus, but will often have a fair degree of humility in the face of this challenge. And I really just appreciate sort of that honesty as well as we come into it. I do want to raise, before we dive into then the kinds of responses, and we've got 12 that we're going to look at today, hopefully, if we can get through it in time. Otherwise, might have to call you back on a part 2. But I wanted to raise the question of, what do you think about the problem of evil for atheists, as it is sometimes being termed? So traditionally, the versions of the problem of evil that we looked at are specifically an internal critique of Christianity, meaning if Christians posit God exists and that God is all powerful and all loving, seems to then struggle to explain either the existence of evil at all or the kinds of evils that potentially are pointless that we see in the world. And so, it's internal critique of Christian attributes of the doctrine of God. But as soon as you get rid of God, often this has been raised by Christians, that atheists too seem to have a problem, because if God does not exist, if the Christian story is not true, if there is no ultimate point to the universe, that if it is some broader accident, a naturalist story, something like that, that it kind of raises not an internal critique of Christian doctrine, but just a question mark around whether you can validate the depth of criticism that people feel. And let me maybe just give a little bit of voice to a couple of people that have brought this up in the past. This is from the 3rd chapter of Mere Christianity, where C.S. Lewis is talking about how his beliefs about justice and injustice potentially may give some cause to think about the existence of God. And he made the observation, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust, but how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? And I think what he's kind of identifying here, and I know this is a quote that has been beaten like a dead horse beyond death, in fact, beyond the afterlife, even beyond the second death. But it's a quote from Richard Dawkins in his book, A River Out of Eden, where he was trying to capture the atheist universe. You could pull something from Bertrand Russell, but just secular thinkers who were trying to capture the ultimate story of a universe without God often say that there is no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference, or some kind of indifferent vision of the universe. And I guess the challenge that this kind of raises, or the problem of evil for atheism, you might say, is it seems to just say the depth of feeling we have when we rail against heaven, the kind of belief, hey, that's evil, that shouldn't happen in a world without God. As soon as you get rid of God, the language of evil itself becomes a very messy moniker. It's usually reduced to some kind of subjective sociocultural evolution perspective. It kind of loses its force, if you could say it that way. What do you think about sort of raising the question about the evilness of evil and the wrongness of suffering? That intuition, do you think that's a point, a soft evidence towards the Christian story, which would validate the protest against evil, would validate the wrongness of suffering? Or do you think it should be something that Christians abandon as a response?
Mm-hmm. I'm not so sympathetic to this type of move, if I'm honest. I think it can feel a bit of a cheap shot against atheists. And I think that it tends to assume that atheists have no way to try and make sense of the objectivity of good and evil. Whereas, actually, I mean, most moral philosophers today probably are non-theists, and most of them are probably objectivists about ethics. And okay, you might say, well, theism has an easier time grounding objective ethics. but there is, at the very least, a very serious debate to be had about that. And I think Christian apologetics too often just shortcuts that and ignores that. So people like Eric Wielenberg, Derek Parfit would be people who've put forward as a serious case that I think has to be engaged with for atheistic objectivism about ethics. So yeah, I guess I don't really like this idea of trying to say that evil is a problem for atheism in anything like the way it is for theism.
So that's the evilness of evil side of it. What about the perception of the wrongness of suffering? So certainly you could say, all right, maybe we can ground objective ethics, but what about the revolt against death and the kind of natural suffering that we see? Do you think that intuition has any deeper explanation in the Christian story than in a naturalistic account? Would you say that that conversation has any value?
Well, okay, so here's one way I can think about this in terms of, I mean, we don't need to get super technical, but a Bayesian probabilistic approach would say if we've got a piece of data on the table and we've got two worldviews or two hypotheses, and we're trying to see if one of them better makes sense of it than the other. So what we do is ask, well, given worldview A, how likely is it that this data would be the case? And given worldview B, how likely is it that this data would be the case? And whichever one makes it more likely is the better explanation. So, yeah, I mean, I think given Christian theism, yeah, we would expect to have this revolt, as you put it, against the suffering of the world. We would expect to have this intuition that this shouldn't be the way things are. Given worldview B, now, of course, it depends how much is allowed to be built into the naturalistic hypothesis, so how much stuff can be sort of treated as kind of part of the background that it's allowed to draw on. But so if we've got humans in the picture with roughly the sorts of brains and cognitive capacities that we have in this naturalistic picture, it does seem to me that it's quite likely we would think that, you know, premature death, disease, accidents are not the way things should be. Because after all, if we didn't think like that, we would be less disposed to try and improve the material conditions of life. We would be less motivated to try and survive, basically. I thought, so if I'm honest, I don't think this move does that much work. So I'm sorry, because I know this is, yeah, I know that this is an approach that some Christian apologists take. I guess I'm a little bit more down on it, though. But I could be wrong about that.
No, that's so useful to get the perspective. How about you, Dan? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, Max and I've talked about this a lot recently as well. I think I share Max's concerns. Basically, look, if you think if you're a theist and you think that there is a successful moral argument, that is to say, you think there's an argument for theism based upon the objective fact of reality, of morality, or moral realism, as we might call it, then you're going to think that this works as a kind of dialectical impasse. And look, I guess like I'm actually more optimistic that there is a moral argument out there. I just don't know if I've come across it yet. Really satisfied me. I've started to think about developing one for myself. That I think would be maybe patch over some of the holes in the others. But look, Adam Lloyd Johnson has a really interesting book arguing based upon his PhD thesis, responding to Wielenberg, proposing a kind of moral argument. Baggett and Walls have a tetralogy, I think, of books developing a moral argument, and those are really worth considering.
Engaging with.
There is, however, another way of framing this problem from Eugene Nagasawa, and he talks about this idea that most people have a existential optimism or a modest optimism, namely that the way in which they live their lives and orient their projects of having children, careers, they admit of a kind of the world is fundamentally not bad, like my life is such that it's good for me to, it is like appropriate for me to continue going about life and developing these projects and having children, bringing more people into the world. I have a paper that is particularly on this problem, but you might think that that's weird, because if you think that on the one hand you have this optimism or moderate optimism about what the world is like, our existence, but on the other hand you have evolutionary history, the kind of systemic problem that all of us have in our throughout the biological life, at least, these evolutionary factors, that seems to put a really pessimistic view on what the world is in fact like, particularly if it's atheistic. And so bringing these two together might have a problem, so Nagasawa argues. And I think that is going to be a more interesting way of approaching the topic, that's less weighed down with these worries about whether naturalists can account for, or non-naturalists can account for moral facts, because that's like, you're just basically, you begin to shift topics a little bit, and it might feel like Max says, like cheating or stacking the if that makes sense.
I really appreciate those cautions, and even I got a hold of Eugen's book actually to have a look at sort of the last third of it, to be able to, where he dives into that. It's really helpful picture. But I think maybe what you're leading into with there is we have maybe a optimistic outlook, but also like a longing for some kind of resources of hope, or something that can animate and keep that optimism alive even when we hit really rough experiences in life. And I think that's sort of another thing that drives people into searching through this question is, yes, maybe a naturalistic story will be able to provide an explanation for some kind of objective evil. It may be able to provide an explanation for why we as creatures who have grown up in this show still have some kind of protest or revolt against it. This doesn't feel right. But what resources does it offer for animating us in the midst of suffering, and even for some kind of broader vision of hope? And maybe that might be a key distinguishing thing as well between the Christian story and the other responses out there, is the kind of resources that the Christian story can offer those who are suffering. And just, obviously want to point out for that, some people are watching this, clicked on it because they say, yep, my life is awful right now. And maybe if we get to the end of this, if we go through the various Christian explanations, maybe you'll just see glimpses of what hope the Christian story really can offer. So do stick with us as we dive in. So we might, in the next part, start to jump to a view of maybe just, I said a dozen or so, or 12 different responses that Christians have offered. Some of them, as Dan was explaining to me just before this live stream, he's trying to map out which of these can you kind of connect together and see as compatible in some kind of, being able to draw from many resources. Some of them branch off or are incompatible with other elements. And we just thought it'd be great to do a survey of where these sort of fit in, and just see, if you're wrestling with this intellectually and you're a skeptic, you don't believe in God, does this help given to maybe lessen the force of the problem of evil, even if it doesn't answer all your questions? Or maybe if you're a person who's a Christian, you don't know how to think about this, and you're wondering, why does God let these things happen? This might also just give you some of the resources that Christian thinkers have dug deep wells over the centuries, and we're going to try and drink a little bit from them. And here are your two guides who are going to help you do that. I'm going to go play the fool and just ask questions along the way, because probably like a lot of you watching this, I haven't had the privilege of studying philosophy formally for decades within some of the greatest institutions in the world. And so I'm really glad to be able to hear you guys do this, and I don't have to answer, and I get to throw it your way. So let's kick off with the first one. And we already saw this word before, or this explanation, the skeptical theism, on that continuum that we had on the other slide. But this traces back to a couple of thinkers, Stephen Wickstra, who actually I cannot find many great photos of. There's someone needs to take photos of every living philosopher in high quality so that idiots like me can use it in presentations. But also Michael Bergman. And this is maybe, Max, we might let you sort of kick off with really what is skeptical theism setting out to do in response to the problem of evil?
Well, thanks, Dan. Yeah, I think firstly to say that skeptical theism is, in a sense, is an intuitive position, which is as old as the hills, right? It's just that this particular formalization of it is something that's come about in the last, 30
40 years.
So, yeah, something like that. So really, we have to locate this in relation to William Rowe's argument from gratuitous evils. So I think Dan put it really well, that what Rowe's wanting to try and do is make a move from saying, well, it appears that this particular evil that we're considering is pointless. We can't think of any greater good that God would need this evil for. And so because it appears that way to us, we can treat that as strong evidence that it in fact is pointless. There is no greater good that God needs this evil for. And skeptical theism, as formulated by Dijkstra and Bergman, is trying to block that move. And it's come to be known, that move of it appears that it's pointless to, therefore probably it is pointless. That's come to be known as the no-seeum inference. So we don't see any reasons. We don't see them. And so we can conclude there are none.
This is actually where, could I say, I like philosophers, because every now and again you come up with a very funny way of summarizing it. It's just sort of the more comical or cartoonish version of the philosophy, and that becomes the popular name for it. Whereas something like skeptical theism is itself a very strange moniker in describing it. But so you've got that no-seeum inference. What's skeptical theism trying to do with that? Yeah,
so skeptical theism is trying to give a principled reason for denying that no-seeum inference. Is trying to block the no-seeum inference. And Dijkstra and Bergman are both trying to do that, and they have slightly different ways of trying to do the block. The way that Dijkstra does it is to put forward a principle that I could try roughly explain like this. It's called the conditional unreasonable epistemic access, or cornea. See, philosophers do like their pithy, memorable labels sometimes. So yeah, but I could
the big words, because if you explain the long form of that, everyone's going, those are 6 words in a row that I don't know what they mean. Yeah.
Right. Yes, exactly.
So cornea.
Yeah. So the way cornea works is, suppose I say, well, I don't see any dogs in my office, so I'm going to conclude there are no dogs, and I think everyone's kind of on board with me at that point, right? It's like, yeah, that seems reasonable, so yeah, I conclude there are no dogs based on it seeming to me that there are no dogs. Suppose that I go, I just took a glance at my hands. I don't see any COVID virus on my hands. So I'm going to conclude there is none. And does that seem as reasonable? Presumably not, right?
Yes. No. Because you don't have Man of Steel infrared vision to see those tiny germ particles.
Right, exactly. And so, yeah, and that's Dijkstra's point, that it has to be the case that putting it roughly, that I would reasonably expect to see the thing if it were there. And as you say, because I don't have the X-ray vision or whatever, I don't have an electron microscope to be able to look and detect viruses. It's not reasonable for me to make the no-seeum inference there. So in fact, it's not that no-seeum inferences are never okay. The one from I don't see any dogs to there are no dogs, that seems reasonable. That's because I would expect to see a dog if it were in my office. So that's basically Dijkstra's principle, and his way of trying to block the move from we don't see any greater goods that God such that God needs this evil to get those greater goods. Therefore, there are none. Dijkstra wants to say, well, that's more like I don't see any COVID viruses on my hands. Therefore, there are none. That's more like that, he thinks, than it is like dog inference. Because why? Because we have cognitively we have cognitive limitations that makes it just very improbable that we would see all of the reasons that there might be. So that's how Dijkstra tries to do it. Bergman tries to do it slightly differently. He wants to say that we have a limited sample set that we of the possible goods and evils that there might be, and the relationships between them. By which he means, that a certain type of good, let's say forgiveness, necessitates there having been an injustice to forgive. Right? There's a kind of metaphysical relationship between those two goods. So what Bergman's saying is our experience of the moral realm, our grasp on the possible goods and evils and the metaphysical relationships between them, is not such that we're able to say we know all of the goods and evils out there, and all of the relationships between them that there could be. Or actually, the way he puts it more precisely is in terms of our sample not being representative. And so, and so when we come to instances of evil where we can't see greater goods such that God needs this evil in order to get those greater goods, Bergman wants to say, well, we're not in a position to say there are no greater goods again because of our limited grasp on the moral realm.
That's so helpful, mate. And I mean, to kind of spell this out, practically speaking, when it comes to even the Bible and the Christian story and the different wrestles that different books of the Bible bring up. I mean, this is sort of classically one where people might mention a book like Job, for instance, which details some really rough suffering that Job experiences, like a series of unfortunate events. And ultimately leads to questions where he's being accused of doing wrong, because surely this must be divine justice for him doing wrong. And he's trying to make sense of, is God in control? How does heaven operate? Eventually gets an audience with heaven, but never gets an answer as to why he was allowed to suffer. It's just kind of gets a vision on how big God is. And God asks a series of 64 questions that Job doesn't know how to answer. And sort of that's the humbling point of Job coming to wrestle with, actually, I don't know what God knows. And therefore God maybe has explanations that are beyond what I have. And I remember reading that story for the very first time, just kind of walking away feeling like it was not satisfying to my own experience of suffering and evil in the world. And then I remember having children. And actually, I've got a photo here of my son, Josiah. He's my oldest boy, but this is when he was 18 months old. This photo was actually just taken seconds after he was told he would grow up to look like me, hence his reaction. Poor guy's in mourning about the future that he's going to experience. But right around the age where Josiah was 18 months, I had to take him into the doctor for his next round of immunizations. And here in Australia, the doctors have a planned schedule. These are the things that we need to do. And so our lovely family doctor, who we've been with for years, says, sorry, Dan, this is a 2-needle experience for this round of immunization. And we know with toddlers, you never get the second stab at it, pardon the pun. And so what I want you to do is you hold Josiah, and I've got the doctor on one side and a registered nurse on the other side, and they're going to inject him simultaneously. And, holding him there, he's lovingly, trustingly staring up at me, and all of a sudden, 1, 2, 3, jab. And he just looks betrayed. Like, he stares up at me completely floored as to why his dad, who he knows loves him, like I play with him and read with him and hug him and take him on little adventures. He knows that I love him. And he also knows that I'm powerful. I'm the one that does all the heavy lifting around the house and all of the harder jobs and carrying the groceries in the car and work out. And so there's a small female doctor and a small female nurse. And you can see his little head doing the calculation, Dad, you can take him, So he couldn't understand why I'm letting him suffer. And it kind of dawned on me, this principle of skeptical theism in that moment, in that he could not understand the reasons that I had for letting him go through this pain. I had good reasons, even from a layman's knowledge of viral and bacterial infection and the purpose of antibodies to be able to fight off greater infections in the future. I had good reasons for letting him suffer, but I couldn't communicate them to him. There was just this gap between me as a 30-year-old dad to him as an 18-month-old boy. And that was the sort of wrestle that I had. All right, well, if that's true of the difference between us, how much more is there a gap between an infinite and all-wise God and then me as a finite human being, as to what I can perceive, what I can take in, the things that I know, the kind of justifications, and particularly when you consider that God doesn't just know everything about the world right now and its relations, but also can look into the future to know how different sets of cause and effect and reactions and human agents and choices will echo down through eternity. And that's maybe another one that people are familiar with. To use a really crude example, if I can, I'm a Marvel fan and quite enjoy the Marvel movies. And if you go and watch an old one now, so spoiler alerts, aren't necessary, but Infinity Wars as part of the Avengers series, there's this scene where Doctor Strange has the time Infinity Stone that allows him to look through all the possible futures that become possible based on free creaturely choices. And so he's looking at all these possible outcomes for the war with Death, Thanos, and trying to figure out, all right, what do we need to do as the Avengers? And then he has this experience where he's talking with Tony Stark or Iron Man. I've looked at 14,605 possible futures, and Tony asks him, how many of those do we win? And he says, actually, there's only one. But the irony of him knowing what needed to play out in order for that final end game, for the right set of things to come together, was that he couldn't tell the others what needed to happen. If he gave them the reasons or the what needs to happen, that would actually undermine or stop the outcome from eventuating. And so he's left in this terrible position where he needs to disappear for a period of 5 years in order for this end game to kind of click in. And this is a really crude example because the parallels aren't perfect, but it's this sort of knowledge of, if God knows what could happen given free creaturely decisions and when and how he intervenes, it's just this big difference between what God knows and what we know in how God could understand the effects of events here and now as they echo on down through time. And so those were just a couple of maybe practical applications of that broader skeptical theism thing that just challenges, given that we are human and small by comparison, given that we don't look through time or corridors of time to be able to understand how things play out in the end. It's that, should we expect to be able to understand all of God's reasons for letting things play out? Is that fair, or I've committed a terrible sin by introducing those concepts?
No, I think that's good. And also, it's worth saying the parent-child thing is an analogy that sometimes skeptical theists explicitly make use of. But also you're right. Another way that skeptical theism could be expressed is in terms of, I suppose the butterfly effect would be one way to put it. The ripple effects of a given action are very difficult, if not impossible. The long-term effects of a given action are almost impossible for us to ascertain. And so, for us to point to some given evil event and say that was needless, that was pointless. You might think on purely sort of grounds having to do with the enormous complexity of the world's causal nexus, let alone stuff to do with whether we have a full grasp of the range of possible goods and evils. You might think that sort of butterfly effect uncertainty is another way to motivate skeptical theism. Yeah. So that's one of the approaches that Christian thinkers offer in response to particularly the evidential problem of evil, a William Rose kind of argument, which is just to say, look, we just don't know what is pointless and what isn't pointless, or we don't have a grasp on what God's reasons might be because we're not God. As far as the heavens are above the earth, so far are God's thoughts above our thoughts and his ways above our ways, is a quote from Isaiah 55. And so it's that sort of maybe caution that the Bible gives, should we expect to have all the answers. And Dan, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah. So as Max has already quite helpfully pointed out, there is a difference between Wykstra's version and Bergman's version. But actually, skeptical theism is like quite a broad umbrella. And there's a philosopher, Perry Hendricks. He's teased out different ways of framing the problem with respect to certain values or deontological ethics, as the kind of ethical considerations being different. But here's a really intuitive one that comes up in the literature too. It's not merely that by reflecting on our own limited cognitive abilities that might give you reason to think that we wouldn't have access to God's reasons. That's just one of the ways of thinking about the problem. Here's another one. Maybe God has good reasons for leaving us in the dark, as it were. Now, this will come up again later, but suppose that you thought that every single action you ever take when considering every single action you ever take of a moral kind, you knew the total state of affairs of every event, right? So you see some car, approaching a girl, she's crossing the road, you think, I could intervene to stop this. But suppose it didn't look to you that you just knew, oh, well, if that girl gets hit by the car, then it's all good, because I know all of the total values. My internal life, my moral motivation, my reasons for acting in certain ways, developing a certain moral character, this will come up again in a moment, but my moral reasons seem to be impinged, unless of course it is that God sets up the world in such a way that he wants us to be in the dark so that we have more reasons to act morally, to care for others, to not do wrong things. Now, that's just one way of thinking about it. But the point here is not merely if we look at ourselves, we think skeptically about our ability to perceive God's reasons. But one might be if we reflect on what God is like and his relationship to us, we might think that God also has good reasons for giving us the kinds of limitations that we do. And that's an important distinction.
That's a really important distinction, actually, to think about, and that will come up with some of the theodicies now that we'll pass out. Well, we might jump to the first, which is when most people hear this, maybe the first place that they think is to do something like this, which is the classic free will defense that was sort of penned by Alvin Plantinga, the one that's considered to have at least rendered that first impossibility argument put forward by Hume as being a bit of a failed argument. But did you want to spell this one out, Dan?
Yeah, of course. So just a little. I'm trying not to be too technical where it's not needed.
You're doing great.
So back when we were thinking about these impossibility or inconsistency arguments, what is happening is that they are saying God exists and evil exists are incompatible. You can't have both, right? And the reason is because you can tease out certain entailments, like Max did, of what is entailed by the existence of God, namely that he's perfectly good, he would want to render evil. And the thought here, there's no possible way that things could be such that you have God and you have evil in the set. Okay, so Alvin Plantinga comes along and he says, so then all we need to do is tell a possible story, even if I think it's false. I just have to tell a possible story that includes God and evil. And I've shown that they're in fact not incompatible. It's not impossible that they both be true. So this is where in steps Alvin Plantinga's free will defense. So what he wants to say is that, well, okay, it's possible that humans have a particular kind of freedom, a freedom that there's become to be known as libertarian freedom. But here's the basic thought. It's possible that humans choose other than they do, right? When I choose to pick up this tablet, it's possible that I didn't do that and then I picked up my water bottle again because I have a sore throat or something like that. That's the intuitive thought here, that it's genuinely up to me in some sense, whether I pick this up or I pick that up. And as soon as we start to introduce that story, then you can see how these points make sense, right? So if God has reasons for setting up the world in such a way that genuine free choice is possible, remember, we're not even needing to commit ourselves to the world being this way yet for it to be a defense. Then it seems like it's possible that I choose to act so long as I'm genuinely significantly free, namely I have moral decisions. So if I choose to not act in a way that would be good if I had acted that way, then there'll be evil because I've omitted on a moral action, and omissions where I'm in some sense morally obligated to act, that's an evil. And so here's one possible way that the world could be. We have significant freedom of this really interesting sort where I can genuinely choose whether or not to do one thing or another, or not to act when I could act. And so long as that's possible, so Plantinga argues, then God and evil can coexist, and there's not an inconsistency between the set. So there is a possible world where God exists and evil exists. And that's the kind of I mean,
Is that the
let's just
kind of
leave it
traded language? So often this will be described as the free will defense. Is that simply because in this sense, it's more on the defense simply against a version of the argument that renders God impossible? What do you make of the defense theodicy distinction? Is this simply a sort of defensive step to try and nullify an argument against Christianity?
Yeah, that's helpful to bring in now, actually, because we're using this language of defense here. We should probably be a little bit more clear about what is meant by that. So historically, there was this language in the literature between a defense and a theodicy. Theodicies being these like God justifying reasons, broadly speaking. And the thought was this: a defense is merely a possible story.
Yes.
Like it's just, it doesn't even need to be likely. It doesn't need to be true. You can think it's false, basically. You can genuinely
it could include the potential for unicorns as long as it's a possible explanation.
Exactly. So long as it's possible, you've shown that they aren't. This is why I don't like the language of logical arguments. Well, at least partly why. Because all you have to do here is just show that there's a logical possible world that makes the set consistent, namely that God exists and evil exists. I tell a story including both of them. The story is possible, even if it's false, even if it's unlikely, and the argument no longer works. Why? Because you told me it was impossible. That's what the argument was trying to do. So that's the defense. The defense is like a merely possible story. This is the historical usage, by the way. So a merely possible story. Then I don't like this definition, but the definition of theodicy came to be God's exact reason. This is God's reason for permitting the evil. I'm not telling you it's merely possible. I'm not even telling you it's likely. I'm basically telling you this is God's reason. Now that's way too strong, clearly, but that's the way that they were seen.
Sure.
And
so you might say, since it's a criticism, the problem of evil is a criticism of the Christian worldview as raises inconsistency between these sets, as you describe. What the Christian is then free to do is to draw from the resources of the Christian story to see, does that give us any insight as to God's reasons? And if there's, some kind of scriptural explanation or justifications for why God would permit bad things, that would be more termed on the theodicy side, because you are feeling like you're landing on some reasons from within the Christian worldview as to why God would. Is that fair?
I think so. I mean, if you think that these are in fact God's reasons based upon your commitment to Christianity, then you would think that. But the theodicy doesn't need to force you to do that. Sorry, Max, you.
No, sorry, just to come in there quickly. I agree with everything Dan said. I mean, one reason I don't find the theodicy defense distinction to be all that useful is that really it has just to do with the strength of confidence with which a given story is put forward. But it doesn't actually have to alter the content of the story one iota. So the very same story could be put forward very confidently by someone who's like, yes, I think this is just what God's up to. Yeah. And another person could put the very same story forward and say, I really have no idea if this is what God's up to, but it could be the case for all we know.
Yeah, sure.
And I think the distinction is a bit misleading and is insofar as it could suggest some difference in the content of the story itself, when actually it doesn't at all.
Yeah. Oh, that's really helpful.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the best way to think of it is a difference in degree, not kind. We're just giving like different degrees of probability to the story and how likely it is to be God's reason. And so defense is the kind of edge marker here. It's merely possible. Theodicy being the other edge marker. Maybe that's a helpful way, but I prefer just to call them all theodicies, to be honest.
Great. And often the names that we've put to these, the literature will use different names, or some become popular as to people talk about it versus what you'll actually find in the philosophical literature. But let's jump in to the next one, because that's kind of the key premise that we'll build out, is that idea that God often wants people to have meaningful relationships. And so the way that you'll popularly hear the free will argument put forward is God could have created a sterile universe without any kind of free agents where everyone just does exactly what he wants as robots or something like that. But God wanted to create beings capable of deep and meaningful relationships, like love, and so created this set a world populated by beings, spiritual and physical or embodied like us, that have this real agency or this free will that also opens the door to evil. C.S. Lewis, in his book Mere Christianity, and he's not the first to note this, but just draws out maybe another feature of the world that God is going to create is one that enables these kinds of relationships. And it's not so much looking at human beings so much as the kind of world that actually opens the door to those sorts of relationships, and how that also might create the possibility for people to experience dimensions of suffering and evil. Did you want to, maybe Max, we'll let you unfold this one a little bit, just sort of the natural law theodicy?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yeah, so sometimes this is called an antecedent free will theodicy. So the idea is that antecedent meaning before or prior to be contrasted with consequent, sort of coming after. So right, the free will theodicies that people will more typically be familiar with are consequent free will theodicies. So there are various evils that are the consequence of the misuse of free will. That's the rough idea anyway. And that's to be contrasted with antecedent free will theodicies, which claim that the world needs to have a certain structure before you can have beings with free will. And in particular,
almost like the stage for the actors to play on. The stage
Yes.
is there before the actors come on it.
That's right, exactly. The stage or the framework in which you can have creatures with this type of freedom, it has to be one with certain kinds of natural regularities. And yeah, well, and it's not just Lewis who's kind of floated this idea. Alvin Plantinga and Richard Swinburn have both alluded to this as well, among many others, actually. Tim Mawson is another one. But yeah, there's roughly this thought that in order to be able to have a sort of matrix or arena in which creatures can act freely, they need to be able to predict with a fairly high degree of certainty at least the immediate consequences, not the long-range consequences. We talked about how tricky that is, but the immediate consequences of their actions. So I need to know that if I if someone fires a gun and they're pointing it at a person, they need to know with a fairly high degree of probability that it's going to grievously injure that person, rather than have the bullet turn into a marshmallow and tickle them or something. Right. So yeah, there's this thought that there needs to be a framework of natural regularities as a prior condition to having creatures who can exercise this sort of freedom. And the thought is, well, this kind of robust framework of regularities is going to be the kind of framework that creatures can run up against and injure themselves, because it's got to be the natural regularities can't just be getting kind of abrogated every time a creature runs into a solid object at high speed. That's roughly the idea.
That's a really helpful explanation. You know, that sort of stage and actors' vision of things. You know, we prize the ability for human enterprise and scientific investigation and development of technologies and agriculture and media, like all the things that make meaningful stewardship of this world possible are based on the existence of that law-like function in nature, or those regularities. And so God creating a world to do that. And to map this on, if I can, those first two explanations of free will, you don't have to do this, but free will and then this world of regularities, this is very much the Genesis story in the Old Testament, where God creates a world where he begins to bring order from chaos and set up these regularities. He creates human beings in his image. We're made for relationships with God, to love God and love others, the two great commandments that Jesus summarizes. But the first commandment given to humanity is to be fruitful and multiply, subdue the earth and rule over it. And it's that small cultivated garden in Eden that we're meant to expand the borders of as we spread out across the planet, bringing order from chaos and framing beauty. And this ability for humans to build culture, to do exactly what God commanded, depends upon both free agency and this concept of regularities in nature itself. Otherwise, we couldn't do any of the study or develop the technologies if they didn't operate the same way each time. So that's maybe just a bit of a map on from how the Christian story may naturally fit some of these, even though that's not necessary for them to service theodicies. Well, let's jump to the third then, because this is where things start getting a lot more sophisticated, because Richard Swinburn's version of the free will theodicy actually starts to draw in various dimensions of the things we've already mentioned, but also others. Did you want to walk us through this one, Dan? That'd be super helpful if you want to give voice to it.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I mentioned earlier Alvin Plantinga's story being merely a defense. So Swinburne is now presenting a story that he thinks is plausibly true. So namely, he thinks that this is not merely a kind of possible world. He thinks this is probably the actual world that we live in. And he has two driving notions that I think is generating his theodicy. So free will's obviously doing the work here. But what's important is these two notions of consequence and responsibility. So when an agent has free will, Swinburne wants it to be the case that they have a really significant kind of freedom, moral freedom, not merely to just be able to choose to do small moral actions like make the bed for my wife so that she's happy. He wants us to be able to perform really significant moral actions.
Because that would be a greater good, for instance. Like this is a better kind of world where we're capable of events that really do affect things.
Absolutely. He wants us to be, so this is the second horn, is this responsibility. He wants us to have really significant responsibility for our actions so that we can, this is, we'll come on to this when we talk about soul making, because the same kinds of themes are present here with Swinburne. But he wants us to be able to be free in such a way that we can shape our moral characters. And so, but if you have that kind of freedom, you need to be able to affect the world and have significant consequences to our actions. If I choose not to act in such a way that I give food to my family, okay, then that's a really significant moral action. But that it's possible, or in fact likely, that there'll be some people that fail to live up to their moral responsibilities, and so the consequences need to be there in order for them to be really morally responsible. One of the operating principles underlying these kinds of intuitions is this notion called ought implies can. The thought here is that if I ought to do something, it implies that I can actually do it. Like if you said to me right now, Dan, you are failing to live your moral obligations because you ought to cure poverty in all of the world, I would say, what do you mean? I can't do that. So how can I be morally responsible?
I thought philosophers were overwhelmingly wealthy. Don't you get into it for the money?
If that were even close to the story. I really do wish that was the case, that even we were given even slightly more than we are. No, we're very underpaid. But the thought here is like that if I ought to do certain things because that's important to shaping who I am, then it has to be possible that I can do it. The world has to be such that I can act that way. The consequences need to be there. And so for Swinburne, these notions shape the way that the world is, both with respect to moral evils, namely evils performed by human agents, let's just call it evils attributable to non-divine agents. And natural evils. Why? Because the world has to be such that even my omissions, my choosing to not act when I could act, have to be weighty. If boulders never fall downhills, then I never have any impetus to act in such a way that I can stop someone from being crushed by a boulder. But also I can't be responsible for not acting in such a way that I stop the boulder from causing some kinds of consequence. So for Swinburne, at least, the world has to be a very particular sort of way, which is very similar, again, to what we just discussed with this natural law-like regularity. But also my freedom needs to be a certain way, where it's really significant, like a morally robust freedom, where I can genuinely choose to shape my character to perform significantly good actions, but also that means that I can perform significantly bad ones. And so this is a kind of crude gloss on Swinburne's argument. I know you've got a lot more text here to unpack that, but hopefully that shapes the
That's really helpful. And it's that idea, again, those two previous kind of ideas are coming together, and with some extra resources as well. And particularly that idea that in the view of the kind of relationship that we're created for, the moral formation that's designed actually requires what we do to affect
I need to be able to pour water down on my shirt.
Yeah.
When I take an overly ambitious drink of water.
Oh, again, it's all the point for the sake of humility, right? And so we'll just keep these texts on the screen as well. People can just kind of wander through and see these other parts that are part of it. But this is, I think, a particularly important sort of feature of Swinburne's to mention as well, that to bring about certain parts of the kind of goals that God has for human beings, what would be a good world, requires certain things now and certain things in the afterlife or God's future world. And there's a big question around what does the Bible teach about afterlife and eternity and all of that. But just to assume sort of a broadly Christian vision of things, that it is possible to come into a right relationship with God forever, where you will live forever in the absence of any suffering or sickness or death and decay, to experience a very different kind of life than what we do now. And the idea that some things in this life are necessary goods, and then some things in the future life will be goods, and it's okay for the bad things in this life to be temporary, to still bring about those goods, but the kind of end vision of things is going to be ultimately good. And so it's permissible for the badness in this world, as long as this isn't the final world. It's going to be eclipsed by something else, and that'll touch into other explanations that we look at further down the track as well. Did you want to add anything to that, Max?
No, that's good, Dan. I think we may come back to this later, but different theodicies will have various answers to the question of why didn't God create heaven immediately, because that obviously is a very natural question to ask. So yeah, as you said, for Swinburne, it's that basically a sort of risky, world of mortality and decay and significant moral free will is a world that contains various kinds of goods that you can't have in heaven, and vice versa. And so God has reason to create both, albeit that he has reason to not allow a world of this kind to endure forever. No,
that's really helpful. And that does raise the problem of heaven, because this is, if you're listening along, sort of the next logical question, or maybe clapback that skeptics might offer. If you're saying it's an entailment of human beings having meaningful stewardship and deep relationships for us to possess free will, and that free will is the explanation for why bad things happen in the world, what does that do then with the Christian vision of heaven, which seemingly from biblical accounts like Revelation 21:4 suggests that there is no death or crying or mourning or pain anymore, for this old order of things passes away? But people in heaven surely still have deep relationships and a meaningful stewardship. I mean, the Bible says we're going to rule and reign with Christ. So if there's free will in heaven, but people don't sin, how? And if that's possible, why didn't God just make that world first? It's kind of interesting, the problem of heaven, that this sort of raises. How have you seen responses play out to that in the past?
Is that one for me, Dan? Or
either. I'll let either of you jump in.
I'll kick off.
You can throw the other person under the bus.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, of course, one thing we haven't really talked about is that you do get theodicies that don't even include libertarian free will at all. So, more kind of, I guess, Calvinistic pictures of how God relates to the world are going to have to find greater goods to sort of, base their theodicy on, that don't involve libertarian free will at all. And so whatever those goods are, when we get to the part of the story about heaven, I suppose that they're not going to have this problem about libertarian free will in heaven, because they don't think we had libertarian free will on earth. But and I should say that, I'm not a Calvinist, as it happens, but all that to say, Calvinists don't encounter that particular problem. They might encounter others. But if one is a libertarian about free will, I suppose yeah, you've got a few different options. So one is to say that basically it's, earthly life is a kind of courtship between humans and God, and that if a person freely chooses to have a relationship with God, they kind of freely sort of enter into a relationship such that thereafter, or at least once they enter heaven, they don't then have libertarian free will anymore, or at least not libertarian free will with respect to doing good or evil. I suppose another
and could be like a parallel of marriage, like, as the Bible makes that picture of almost the courtship of heaven and earth, and then the marriage to come in the new creation, and sort of, as a bachelor, you're free with options as to who you will marry, but once you've used your freedom to make the choice as to who you will marry, that marriage has begun. It's a different kind of freedom you experience within marriage for intimacy than freedom of choice outside of marriage.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, indeed. I guess another option might be to say that creatures could opt out of heaven once they get there, so that the freedom to do evil does remain. It's just that because heaven is heaven, it can't allow for the occurrence of evil. If a creature wants to do evil, then they have to exit heaven, basically. That might be another option, I suppose. At least it's there in kind of the space of logical possibilities. Maybe I'll hand over to Dan at that point.
Yeah, sure. This is I think it's an important objection if you think that free will is doing all of the work. And I think Max has kind of highlighted this. If you think free will is the thing that's doing all of the work, then this is going to be more of a problem than if you think it's kind of contributing to the picture or something like that. But let me just, I don't think I'm going to give you an exhaustive picture that's going to satisfy everyone here. I don't think maybe that will ever happen to the problem of evil generally. But let me just also sketch some additional considerations. So one of the things that plays the role here is that I mentioned this earlier, a thing called libertarian free will. It's a kind of free will that person has when they're able to act other than they do, and they're not determined when they act. Namely, they are in some sense the ultimate responsible agent when they act. It's not that there are any outside forces causing them to have the belief or the desire to act that way. Rather, they can at least act, at least sometimes, freely in such a way that they were not determined to do so. But in the free will literature, broadly speaking, there's actually an atheist philosopher who recently passed away this year, a philosopher called Robert Caine, who is a libertarian, and he draws out these actions called SFAs, self-forming actions. These are actions that a person takes such that they shape themselves to perform that action more regularly in the future. So here's a thought. Okay, this has been defended in the literature as well. What if my role in this life is to have the responsibility to choose, and this is a good, to choose to shape myself to have such a character that when I come across a moral state of affairs, I act without even having to think about it, right? I am so virtuous that I don't have to think, oh, should I do this? Should I not? Competing desires. I act towards the good naturally. Because if you were to trace back, in some sense, my chain of acting, it would one day, back in the past, you'll find an action where I genuinely struggled. I wrestled. Then I chose the good. Then that came up again, and it became easier and easier, because each time I'm choosing, I'm shaping myself. And so you might think that freedom that we get in heaven, we can't sin because we've so shaped ourselves to never desire it. Like, there's a reason that right now I have the freedom to pick up a pen and stab myself in the eye with it. I am genuinely free to do that. But you'll struggle to find a nearby possible world at which I do it. Right? I'm very, 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 very incredibly unlikely to stab myself in the eye with a pen or do any other number of obscene actions, even though I am in fact free to do them. Why? Because at least in part, I've chosen over the course of my history to, in the case of avoiding pain, obviously that has an easier solution, but some of them don't. So I think this, like, shaping my character, the freedom becomes in some sense a derivation of the freedom and action that I choose to shape my character in such a way when I was on Earth. Some of then after this introduced the notion of purgatory. There are some, believe it or not, there are Protestant people who believe in purgatory. Jerry Walls.
Yeah, I had Jerry Walls on for the hell conversation a couple of weeks back, so he's certainly down that angle.
Yeah, there we go. There we go. So Walls does, in fact, hold this view. But the thought here is something like this. What if we haven't shaped our characters in such a way that when we die, we're ready, as it were?
We're ready, yeah. Because like almost no Christian you can think of would fit that. And certainly I've sort of shared these ideas with people who don't believe this. But what about that guy that died next to Jesus? Surely he didn't have enough time to get ready, and yet he seems to get to go to paradise as well. So yeah.
Absolutely. And some people, babies, all of these other kinds of worries that come up with respect to shaping one's character. So you might think, though, that there's a way in which God can cooperate with the agent throughout their moral transformation. Maybe there's post-mortem opportunity afterwards, which then gets into another problem, which isn't this problem, namely the problem of hell. But for now, we can bracket that off, because what we're really considering is what implications our free will theodicy has for heaven, and particularly when heaven factors into free will theodicies. And that's one solution, right? That the character has chosen to form themselves in such a way that over the period of their so acting, they've shaped themselves. God will then work with people. Yeah. Sorry, that's basically it. God will then work with people for those who haven't, namely most of us, get to that stage, and namely the goods of pursuing the good life, as it were, namely to act in such a way that you form your character to be morally virtuous. That outweighs the kind of creating heaven first problem.
Yeah, and even if not everyone gets to participate fully in that process, so like you said, the baby's situation, or people who die in a very morally destitute position but have put faith in God or in Christ, the process itself in the majority of cases actually is a good that contributes to the world as well. We actually have a short video on this, is there free will in heaven, where I spell out sort of 4 different responses that I think are helpful, actually all the ones we just mentioned in different kind of language. So these guys get the pro philosophical chops behind it. I just use humble sort of theological language. So I'm really glad to be able to call on our philosophical brothers to dive into a little bit deeper. Let's jump to another one and keep moving. This one is maybe one that a lot of more academically minded Christians almost avoid, because it's got such obvious spiritual, supernatural seeming dimensions to it. And it's the idea that human beings are not the only moral agents in the world that God created, but there are also other spiritual beings, namely angels, who also can have an impact on how our experience of the world is playing out. So this one is particularly defended by Max, I think the principal at Wycliffe Hall, at least last time I knew, Michael Lloyd. But this sort of cosmic conflict theodicy, you'll see other thinkers like Greg Boyd feeding into this as well, and Mike Heiser, and but I'd love, maybe Max, if you want to give some voice to this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's 2 ways that this gets going. One is more purely philosophical, reflecting on the fact that the standard free will theodicy seems to kind of come up short when it comes to natural evils, basically, is the thought. I mean, now obviously, yeah, we talked about Richard Swinburn's sophisticated free will theodicy, which wants to say that to have this really robust, weighty kind of free will, we've got to live in a world where there's opportunities to show courage, and it's sort of slightly merging into a soul-making theodicy there too. But at any rate, the sort of if you like, kind of first blush free will theodicy, okay, it seems to get some traction with moral evils, but not really any traction with natural evils. And so the thought is, well, what if there are free agents who are non-embodied and who have significant causal powers over the physical structure of reality that we inhabit, and who are able to use their free will for good or ill, then it looks like a free will type theodicy is able to start to have something to say about natural evils. So that's a more purely philosophical way to kind of get to a sort of as you call it, cosmic conflict theodicy, or sometimes an angelic fall theodicy. The other way to sort of get there is through reflecting on biblical texts that you might think there isn't a clear narration of a sort of fall of the angels, but it does seem to be quite heavily implied in a number of places in the biblical texts, not least Genesis.
Like in Genesis 6, and you've got the serpent in Genesis. You've got books of Revelation, where a third of the heavenly host get cast out of heaven.
Jesus, right. Jesus seems to, if one could say that Jesus has a theodicy at all, it seems like it's an angelic full theodicy. That would be my hunch anyway. Jesus at one point says that he himself saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven, right? So there's these various hints and implications that there was some sort of event in which angels, some angels anyway, rebelled against God and began to use their freedom to try and harm the created order. And so then the thought is that now you start to be able to have a free will based story to tell about why there are such things as disease, natural disasters, etc., etc.
And this maybe even could play out in a number of ways. I mean, you could have a view where an angelic fall actually predates any kind of human fall, such that the chaos in the world itself, like death and decay, could be attributed to the consequence of these beings with powers affecting the creation itself, or the material world. Or you could say that it postdates humanity, and yet they're active now as beings in the world who are bringing around either behind the scenes temptations and causal events, or natural evils actually can be attributed in some cases to sort of the dark activities of these spiritual beings. So there's kind of two different ways. Does it explain all natural evil, or does it explain some natural evil?
And I think no, that's good. I mean, as far as I can tell, most of the cosmic conflict theodicy proponents out there, including Michael Lloyd and Greg Boyd, want to say that it way predates human moral evil and so on. And I think that if you're drawn towards this theodicy, that seems to me the obvious way to go, because you get explanatory power with respect to the fact that decay and death and predation seem to be built into the fabric of the biological world, whereas appealing to human sinfulness doesn't seem to get you anywhere with respect to those things, as far as I can see.
I am curious on that one, in the sense that and I'd love to play this out with the two of you, and I'm doing this live, so shoot me down and say that's a dumb thought. But if it's possible, for instance, for a God to retroactively apply the atoning work of Jesus to people being reconciled to God in the Old Testament, right? So you've got something that takes place roughly 30 or 33 AD, and yet its effects seem to be active 1,000, 2,000, however many thousands of years in the past for people who put faith in God. Could God have created a world where the effects of sin are retroactive as well? So the fall of Adam and Eve is already part of the story implied, and even though they don't experience that world because they're in a Edenic situation, so the consequences aren't the reason for the fall. But I'm just curious about the explanatory power of something like that, because if Christians are, let's say, committed to an evolutionary account of the origins of most of the biological diversity, so a theistic evolution position, but you still want to say that the curse on nature is the consequence of human sin, is that explanation still open to you, I guess, is my question.
I'll be brief and I'll hand over to Dan. I mean, I think it's there in the space of logical possibilities. I don't find it terribly compelling, if I'm honest. So I guess one way to put it might be in terms of, I think Marilyn Adams gave this analogy. it's like, suppose you leave a toddler in a room with a hot stove, and you tell the toddler, don't touch the stove. If you do, the entire world will blow up. Now, yes, and suppose the toddler does touch the stove. On one level, you could say the toddler is responsible for the world blowing up. On another level, you could say you were kind of dumb to set up this scenario such that, the toddler kind of had it as a possibility open to him or her that they could touch this stove and it have such far-reaching consequences. So, yeah, I guess if the thought is like that, God didn't have to set it. God wasn't sort of metaphysically constrained to retroactively apply the fall, but he chose to. It's not really clear why.
Why? Yeah, I agree. I agree with that.
It seems like it needs a whole theodicy of its own.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if the story is God sort of metaphysically was constrained, he had to, then I guess I'm sort of mystified as to why that is. So that for me would be why I don't find it hugely compelling.
Yeah. I think I'm in the same camp. I've always just been curious about that one. Let's move because we're running out of time, and I want to keep surveying the possible answers. This one is a huge one. I mean, you see something like this in the early church father Irenaeus, and it's probably one of the key features is this concept of a soul-making theodicy. John Hick's been a major proponent in the literature. Dan, did you want to just give some voice to it? We've already been touching on some of these themes, but yeah, just want to give maybe a broad explanation of the whole idea of soul-making as one reason why God might allow various kinds of moral and natural evils.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah. Soul making, we have touched on it because, of course, Swinburn has these very similar ideas built into his free will theodicy. But the general notion is this. There is a crucial or tightly woven relationship between the virtues that a person has or grows over the course of their life and the obstacles and the sufferings and the evils that they've had to overcome. Sometimes these get categorized under the label of like greater good theodicies. But generally the idea is this, like, it's in order for me to be courageous, like genuinely be courageous, I need to have done something such that I was fearful, there was risk to me, I was in a very difficult circumstance, and I nonetheless chose to act or to pursue it. In order for me to be considered any of these like important virtues that we might pick out, it's important that I've built those virtues in virtue of the fact that I've overcome circumstances that built them. This is the kind of idea. I need to have a careful mapping between what the world is like, such that I can form a character by being shaped by my response to the world. Can I be a resilient character unless if I have never undergone any challenges at all? I don't. So the soul-making theodicist would want to say, I don't even know what that means. What does it mean to be courageous if you've never had to pursue a challenging situation? What does it mean to show true forgiveness if no one's ever really truly harmed you or wronged you? Like genuinely, I'm not talking about like, I forgive you for stepping on my toe in the train. I mean, like, there are some cases out there in the world where murderers have slaughtered families, and nonetheless the mothers have turned around and said, I forgive you genuinely. And that kind of thing, whether or not you think it does the explanatory work, you have to admit that kind of forgiveness, that kind of forgiveness wouldn't be possible unless the world was such that they could genuinely say that to be the case. They've been wronged in such a way that forgiveness is the cut. So those are the kinds of concerns that soul-making theodicies want to pick up. Yeah.
I mean, a very intuitive level, the kind of stories that we love or the movies that we love. I mean, you start out with a character in the Shire like Frodo Baggins. There's nothing all that incredible about this character. There's raw materials there, like these inklings that there's something unique about them, but it's through the experiences of going on this grand journey to take the ring to Mordor that character becomes the hero-like character through struggle and challenge, that this triumph ultimately emerges and their character is forged, and they build these virtues that they wouldn't have had opportunity if they'd stayed in the safety of the Shire itself. And so then you have these grand hobbits return wearing royal-like robes on horseback at the end of the story, and they're kind of seeing their little hobbit friends and people around them, and there's this knowing look. They are very different because of the experience that they've endured. Like, that would be maybe a parallel to this kind of concept of soul making. There has to be the experiences that give the opportunity for these things to be forged, for it to be meaningful.
Sure.
Yeah.
Let me just row back a little. I did say, like, you have to admit that this kind of thing is a necessary relation. But of course, there is a challenge to be raised there. I don't want to, by any means. This was more like a rhetorical flourish on behalf of the soul-making theodicists. But nonetheless, you can see that the kind of character that you have, it seems like having it being formed, at the very least, this is a kind of minimal soul-making theodicy, having it being formed by being shaped by the response to your environment being such that you genuinely have sufferings and challenges that you overcome is good, a kind of good that you can't get if you just had it. I don't even know what that quite means, to be honest, but had it from the start.
Yeah. Well, for these next bunch, it might be useful for us just to say, what is the unique contribution that it offers compared to, I think we've laid a lot of groundwork in terms of sort of free will side of things, soul making, the world that's required, that's kind of helpful. So I think the couple that we'll look at now, this one is from Eleanor Stump, who's just retired recently from teaching. But her account kind of points at the idea of what is the greatest good and the kind of relationship ultimately that can come about in terms of relationship with God. Did you want to speak to this one, Max, the sort of vision of the loving union theodicy?
Yeah, sure. So Stump basically is thinking that God is entitled to use suffering in a person's life for fundamentally two reasons, which are connected with one another. So the way she's thinking of it, there's a worst possible situation for a human being to be in and a best possible situation for a human being to be in. The worst possible situation for a human being to be in is a state of self-willed kind of alienation from God, from others, and even from oneself, which is basically what she thinks hell is. And by the way, actually, the stuff C.S. Lewis says about hell being, the gates being locked on the inside, that kind of thing. This is actually a very similar kind of thought.
Yeah.
You also get, Stump is very influenced by Aquinas on this. I don't know if that's where Lewis got these ideas from, but they're all in the same kind of vein. And then, the best possible situation for a human being to be in is to be in right relationship with God, others, and oneself. And Stump's thought is that God can legitimately use suffering in a person's life to try and steer them away from that worst possible fate and try to draw them towards the best possible fate, that loving union with God. C.S. Lewis's problem of pain is very much in the same vein. The whole thing about pain being a megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And the way he talks about pain being such that your kind of self-centered pretensions can be shattered, all of that sort of thing. That is very much the same idea. So the thought is that God can use pain as an instrument to try and draw us away from that kind of self-willed alienation and towards that union with God. Yeah,
that's really helpful. This one comes from Marilyn McCord Adams, whose book on horrendous evil sort of gave voice to the problem that William Rowe points out in the evidential problem. And it often has a lot more application, either on terrible dimensions of moral evil, so people that do things to others that seem entirely irredeemable, or particularly to kind of natural evils. And she comes up with something that obviously raises the appeal towards a Christian vision of eternity, or the kind of final defeat of evils in the return of Jesus to set everything right, and then draws out a few things here. Did you want to give voice to these, Dan, just as sort of the benefit of what she thinks this vision of eternity and of the relationship with God, how that can defeat what in this life may actually be a horrendous evil, but can ultimately be overcome with the life to come.
Yeah, although if I may, can I just speak to the notion of defeat first? Because it's not. So we should be precise, a little bit more precise about defeat here for a moment, because the language of defeat for Adams and others doesn't merely mean responding to the problem of evil. So there are two ways of viewing the way that values and disvalues can be connected. Here's one of them. If I have some state of affairs with positive value 2, and it's connected to another state of affairs with disvalue, -1, then the total state of affairs consistent with both of them is going to be something like 1. This is what we think when the states of affairs like this, the values are additive. You can just add them together, and then the sum is equal to whatever the sum of its parts is. But here's another way of thinking about value that comes from G.E. Moore, picked up by Chisholm, and then developed quite significantly by Adams, which is this notion of organic unity. Here the thought is that when you have values that you add together, it's not always the case that they're merely additive, that you just get the kind of value of whatever you plugged in. There are some goods or some states of affairs that are going to be greater than the sum of their parts. So the thought is, I have some state of affairs that's positively valuable. I have some state of affairs that's negatively valuable. That normally you might think that when you add them together, then the total value is going to be less than the value of this good thing. Adams and others want to say that's not always how it works. When you add the evil or the disvaluable state to the total state of affairs, it might be that the total value increases. So we were talking before about, you mentioned Frodo Baggins and all of this other kind of thing. If you isolate the part where he's wrestling with whether or not to take the ring, whether or not to, he's wrestling inwardly, you might think that's disvaluable. But when you add it into the total narrative, the overall narrative, the overall value increases in virtue of the fact that it had a disvaluable part of it.
Yes.
And so the defeat then for Adams is that evil is incorporated into a state of affairs such that the total value of everything is actually greater, even though we can still say of the horrendous evils, they are intrinsically evil, they are intrinsically disvaluable. It's just that there's something interesting that happens when you add it to the whole, to the total world being identified with Christ, that the total value is greater than the sum of its parts. So that's the notion of defeat we're working with. We're not just talking about adding it in and trying to outbalance it, kind of like counterweigh it. We're talking about something more interesting, which is this greater than the sum of its parts language. I hope that was helpful as a kind of...
No, that's actually really helpful, because we as we're using the story analogy now, let's say like the whole story of reality, I think that carries, all of a sudden you've got a better story as a whole. It's enriched, it's deepened, it add new layers of meaning than what it would have had if you never included that element in the first place. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so for Adams, being united with God, with Christ, is going to have a significant effect on this total organic unity.
Yeah.
The total details are quite large, and it's bound up with things like universalism. But here are some really significant redemptive properties of being bound with Christ. Identification, as it is here, namely that our sufferings better enable us to identify us with the greatest suffering of all, namely Christ's atoning work. Our gratitude is the thought that our ability to be grateful to God of being united with him is so much more. Again, this is the kind of greater than the sum of its parts language. It's much more rich and vibrant, being united with God once one has suffered oneself, namely when you're identifying with the sufferings of Christ.
Yeah.
But also this insight language that comes out from Adams is this point that we can see more greatly a whole bunch of different things in the Christian life. So sin, depravity, we get to see quite how horrendous that is. How much greater being united the sacrifice of Christ is, given our own experiences. But these are all bound up here with this language of defeat, that when our sufferings, particularly the horrendous sufferer, is united to Christ, the total is in some sense greater than the sum of its parts, for some of the reasons outlined here.
Yeah, mate, that's so helpful. And playing, just maybe continuing that story theme, you spoke before, Max, about the potential of having explanations or theodicies that are often more linked with a Reformed or Calvinistic vision of things. And certainly this one historically has been what's known as the Felix Culpa theodicy that traces its roots as far as we can see back to Augustine. Did you want to give voice to this one?
Sure, yeah. I mean, Alvin Planting is probably the most recent kind of person who's given voice to it in the literature. But yeah, roughly the way he puts it is that so incarnation, God becoming human and making atonement and redeeming human beings is a tremendously great good. He argues that it's so good that it's any world that contains that good is going to be better than any world that doesn't contain it. Intuitions are probably going to diverge a lot there in terms of, including among Christians, as to whether they buy into that. But anyway, be that as it may. So yeah, then the idea is, well, okay, if you grant Plantinga that a world with divine incarnation, redemption is truly, or that good is truly sort of overwhelmingly great, such that it makes a world that has it better than any that lacks it. Well, then you kind of have to take account of the fact that in order for divine incarnation and redemption to be possible, redemption logically entails there was something to redeem. There was a human problem of sin that needed redeeming. And so the thought is, well, all of the best worlds are going to be ones that contain divine incarnation and redemption, and therefore that also contain the sin that made divine incarnation and redemption necessary.
Yeah, that's a really maybe counterintuitive thought for a lot of people. But like, consider, I guess, and to put this even in more broad terms, how much more we know about what God is like because we've passed through the dark scene of the fall and evil and suffering and death, in that we get to see God's willingness to be humbled in incarnation and take on the form of humanity. We get to see God's willingness to go through suffering and horrendous evil in how he was tortured in Christ. And so this depth of God's love for us that we see, as well as the terrible cost of sin, is maybe one of the things that actually plays back into that problem of heaven that we're talking about before. Adam and Eve in the garden wouldn't have had knowledge firsthand of the bitterness of death and suffering and evil and sin, nor would they have known the fullness of the depths of God's love for them that we now, because we're on this side of the cross, have seen. And so you can see some ways in which our world can be enhanced, or our knowledge of God and who he is can only come about through a world like this that may be considered a greater good. So that's sort of the Felix Culpa idea. Here's a friend of ours, Vince Vitale, and certainly his non-identity theodicy is maybe another one which isn't instantly intuitive to everyone, but when you think about it, there's something to it. Dan, are you familiar with this one?
Yeah, sure. I can.
Yeah, did you want to spell that out a bit?
Of course, yeah. Again, had to be try not to be
concise
too complex, because there are lots of things going on,
elements to it.
Here's the general idea: the person that I am at the moment, namely my identity, that is at least partly constitutive of my history, the things that I've been through, starting from my parents, namely that specific egg and that specific sperm. That's going to be the minimal requirement here for what it takes for me to be me. But more than that, you might think, the character that I have now that's bound up with who I am is me based upon the sufferings that I have undergone throughout my life, the challenges that I've faced, the character that I have formed. So you can bring in elements from soul-making kinds of considerations, the decisions I've made. All of these things are bound up in what it takes for me to be me. And so the thought is like, well, God couldn't have made a world in which I exist and you exist, given that you would have all of the same things true of you, being you. For every person, it was impossible for God to created the world consisting of us, but have none of the evil and suffering that, in some sense, made me, or you. And so the thought here with the non-identity theodicy for Vitali and others, because he's also working from Robert Adams, Marilyn Adams' husband. The thought is that it's crucial that if God loves us and has grace, love for us as the community of people that we are, that he has the world with the sufferings that it has in it. And so the thought is God hasn't wronged anyone by bringing you into existence or creating the world the way that it is with you in it, because if the world had been different, you wouldn't be in it, so you wouldn't have been wronged. Because you are bound up with your history, right? So it wouldn't be you that existed if there were no sufferings. So he hasn't wronged you by allowing the world to be as it is. In fact, he's done it because he loves you and because he wants you for you with your causal history. And so that's a kind of a kind of crude gloss on this type of theodicy.
And there is a profound dimension to that when you consider that God could have created any number of other possible worlds with any untold billions of possible creatures. And yet of all of those worlds, he chose to create the one with you in it. And that's not meant to inflate anyone's head to the size where it explodes, but it is quite moving to think that God chose the world with us in it. Yeah, it certainly is just another expression, I think, of sort of coming to that, and maybe another way even to consider language around predestination and God's foreknowledge and providence and middle knowledge and all other options that come onto the table in a theodicy like this one. But yeah, really helpful clarifying that thought. One of the questions that kind of comes up for a lot of people is, where do animals, my numbers in this are terrible, 1 2 2 4 3, there we go. Good thing I'm not a math major, but is sort of where do animals fit into a lot of these explanations, because often we're talking about free will and agency and the ability in eternity for a greater good to be able to wipe away the tears of this life, so to speak. So Trent Doherty comes in with what sometimes is called a fallen soul-making theodicy, or in his book, The Problem of Animal Pain. Max, do you want to maybe just see what is it that this specifically adds in trying to make sense of non-human animal suffering?
Yeah, I mean, the thought is often had that animal pain is particularly hard to explain for theists, because
like Alex O'Connor, for instance, says that this is the hardest problem for theism in his mind, is the animal pain side of things.
Yeah, and I might be inclined to agree with that. I think, and the reason it seems so hard is that the usual strategies that theodicists will try to bring to bear with respect to human suffering just don't seem to work well when it comes to animal suffering. So, animals it's not very plausible to think they have libertarian free will. They don't have a kind of robust sense of themselves. Soul-making theodicies don't look like they're going to work. Or do they? And so this is where Trent Doherty's work comes in. He wants to suggest that animals sort of post-mortem, this is the thought he's toying with anyway, that that animals will become kind of full persons, such that they will be able to look back and see kind of the part that their suffering played in this kind of great tapestry of this kind of great tapestry that God was weaving, I suppose, and be able to kind of in some sense affirm the part that they played in that, albeit retrospectively, and so I think what Trent is trying to do here is to take quite seriously a constraint that Eleanor Stump has placed on theodicies, where Eleanor Stump wants to say that the suffering that an individual experiences needs to ultimately benefit the sufferer themselves. And this is a controversial issue among theodicists. Richard Swinburn quite vigorously denies that constraint. But anyway, Eleanor Stump thinks that that is a constraint that theodicists should be bound by. And I think this is, in a way, Trent trying to tell a story, a possible story, one which could be true for all we know, according to which animals do get to be ultimately the beneficiaries of the greater goods that flow from the suffering they undergo in their earthly lives. And because during their earthly lives, they're not in a position to kind of have a robust sense of themselves to understand, the concept of greater goods and so on, that it looks like the only way that could happen is if there's a post-mortem scenario in which they gain full personhood, rationality, and so on.
They become the creatures in Narnia, to quote C.S. Lewis again, who have higher cognition in that sense and can read back over the story and find, yes, I was only an extra in this story, but still played a significant role in bringing about the final end game that now I get to enjoy reading the whole story and being part of the world that it brought about. Yeah, and that's interesting. I was quite surprised seeing how many different Christian thinkers throughout history have flirted with those sorts of ideas, that potentially there could be post-mortem or eternal resurrection rationality for non-human animal-like creatures as well. And I mean, that raises some hilarious sort of just imagination questions of how many bunnies are going to be part of the new creation and how many sharks and all of those sorts of broad considerations. But certainly it's an interesting step.
Yeah, I think in effect, sorry, I'll just briefly say this and I'll hand over. It's in effect quite similar to the move that Jerry Walls is making with Purgatory, in the sense that it seems that you have some creatures.
You right, mate?
Oh, sorry. I'm here still. Yeah, we in effect seem to have some creatures whose story ends too abruptly for them to be able to kind of pursue that trajectory that they may have been going along. And so I think you can see that this would also apply to children who die prematurely. I mean, you might try like a Trent style theodicy, where there's some kind of opportunity in a post-mortem state for them to develop their characters more.
Totally. Well, I think we just lost Max, but that was a perfect timing for it, because he actually had to end stream at night at his time now. So huge thanks to Max. We'll make sure we put links to him down in the show notes. And Dan, I don't know if you need to jump off as well. This is the last one, so feel free to.
This is the last one, then.
Cool.
Cool.
And then I'll take over.
Admittedly, I'm less familiar with this theodicy, but I take it there's this view in ethics known as exemplarism.
That's it.
Which is a type of moral theory that sees the meaning of the concepts bound up in the meaning of the concepts bound up in what it means to be good or goodness, are in some sense conceived of as idealized or higher level exemplars, like agents who are admirable, who exemplify these goodness properties. Exemplars are kind of they play a role in grounding what it means to be good, because if you ask what it means to be good, at least on one story, on one telling, you point to the exemplars. That's what it means to be good. And so I think here the idea is this, that transforming into an exemplar, the type of person who's able to exemplify certain virtues, God, allowing you to have the kinds of experiences that you do, grants you the opportunity to become a moral exemplar. And I take it here the idea is that you're going to play a role in grounding what it even means for humans, at least, to be good.
That's right. That's it.
And that's a huge, I would say responsibility, but
because you think about that, like when you say, what does it mean to be a good human being? You don't tend to think abstract ideas. You tend to think examples. So we
Right.
would set some kind of vision of a moral ladder. And obviously Jesus of Nazareth is at the peak of pretty much everyone's vision of what that moral ladder looks like. Someone who loves God with all of his being and loves his neighbor as himself and perfectly adheres to the moral code that he patterns out. It's hard to think of these goods abstracted from actual real world examples, right? And so that's the kind of concept here, is that these exemplars actually end up playing a role in grounding that morality in the world and bringing it about in and of itself. And I think for Josh, the attempt here is to try and say, all right, is there some kind of theodicy that can make sense of why God would allow children and cognitively impaired adults and non-human animals who don't actually get to become those moral exemplars in the world? Actually, what explanation could be offered? And it's that they're part of the world that allows exemplars to form in cognitively normal adults and some children. And so he says, even though they may play what seems like something of an extra role in bringing about goodness in the world, they still play a role because people become moral exemplars in the way that they interact and learn to love and care for children and cognitively impaired adults and non-human animals, and that the world that these moral exemplars end up helping to bring about, and that the other group of beings also contributed to, those same set of beings get to then experience that world that has then come about. So very similar. It's like got some similar lines to Trent Doherty's thing there. It just has this particular exemplarist spin on things.
Sure.
Yeah, and this is really with Josh, like you start to see him draw in very clearly dependence upon other theodicies and resources from different theodicies, in that you're starting to say, okay, which ones of these can I join together to try and create a cohesive explanation that maybe is a little bit more confident in providing the reasons that are there. But maybe that's a bit of a summary of like a dozen different Christian responses. And I just want to say a huge thanks, Dan. I know you've got to head off because you actually do important things in the world and have time constraints on you. Just want to say thanks so much both for the work that you do and for being willing to jump on and help us wander through a big set of ideas. And you did a great job just relating that to everyone. So thank you.
Oh, great. No, absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on. And anything that I said that was silly, I take full responsibility for it. Anything that I said that wasn't silly, it's due to the great thinkers and minds that are out there that I've been able to draw on. So
so good, mate. And plus the benefit of having two Dans on the one live stream is all the dumb stuff was me and all the great stuff was you. You can just play it off that way. Great.
Great.
Cool, mate. Well, it's great to see you. No worries. We'll see you again.
Bless you.
Bye.
Thank you.
All right, well, let me maybe round this out a little bit, because if you're still following along, that's been nearly 2 hours just exploring mostly the philosophical side of this problem. And we've been diving into different resources from the Christian story, looking at some answers that seem to emerge from the various books of the Bible and what Christian thinkers have really dug out of there. But I do want to recognize, I think the Bible offers some answers to the problem of evil. I am pretty similar to Max and to Dan in that I'm certainly confident Scripture doesn't give us all the answers. And if you're looking for a takedown on the problem of evil, I think we can weaken its force. I think we can philosophically neuter it somewhat, but I don't think there is a complete why for every individual instance of suffering. And I think when it comes to the Christian story, maybe this is the way in which God wants to form us, shape us, but rather than giving us a why, he gives us a who. And the ultimate answer for most of life's deepest questions is not an explanation from afar or simply a book, but it was the incarnation of the second person of the Trinity, God the Son, in Jesus Christ. It's not a why, it's a who. And one of the things for me, as I was actually reading through the big story of the Bible, what I often call the Christian story, is that when I finally got to the stories about Jesus, I came to see him making these broad claims that if you've seen Jesus, you know what God is like. In John 14, speaking to Philip, he said, Philip, you know me. If you've seen me, you have seen the Father. I and the Father are one. Or Colossians 1:15, the Apostle Paul makes the claim that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. Or the anonymous writer to Hebrews speaking about how he's the exact representation of his nature. That if you want to know what God is like, if you want to know whether he's there and whether he cares in a world that is full of lament and suffering and evil and pain, look no further than Jesus. And as I was reading through the Christian story, this may be more helpful to you if you're genuinely wondering, does God love me? Does he really care? Why do I have any reason to think that I can trust him? I just want to share with you a few of the things that stood out to me from reading through the Gospels. One of the ones that had a huge impact was the idea of seeing Jesus' compassion and him weeping at the graveside of his dead friend Lazarus. And this story comes in John chapter 11. It's the shortest verse in the Bible, and when verses were added in the 15th, 16th century. But John 11:35, Jesus wept. And in this story where Jesus travels to Bethany, he knows his friend Lazarus has died. He's met on the outskirts of the town by two grieving sisters, Mary and Martha, in turn. And he has a conversation with them in the midst of their grief. It seems like Jesus knows why he's going to Bethany. He has this view of he's going to wake up his friend. He's going to raise him from the dead. And yet the knowledge of what's going to happen in the future doesn't take away from the very deep experience of grief as he is encountered with these two grieving sisters and considers the death of his friend. And Jesus breaks down and weeps, which is not exactly a dignified position for a man of his rabbinic station. And yet he pours out this compassion. And that really challenged the view that I had of God, that God is somewhere distant, locked away from us in heaven's joys, completely unaware of earth's pain, that he feels cold and doesn't really feel our suffering. And yet here you have this picture of God who is deeply moved. He is grieved by what we experience. And it challenged me with the thought that if God really is an Heavenly Father to us as earthly kids, and he feels more deeply about what we go through here in this life than anything that we're able to conjure, that our tears are largely borrowed, that our laments are echoes of heaven. And so that picture of Jesus weeping was one that was profoundly challenging to me. You also have this idea of Jesus healing, that Jesus doesn't just accept suffering and sickness and death as normal or as part of the world that he intended, but he steps in to do something about it. His compassion stirs him to act. And the Gospels speak of Jesus's miracles, these expressions of divine power, as signs or semeion. They point towards something. They point towards this future. Jesus went around restoring sight to the blind, or music to the deaf, dancing to the lame, even bringing people like Lazarus back from the dead. And these healings, these miracles of Jesus are meant to be what he described as a foretaste of God's future, the kingdom of heaven breaking into now, which leads to this idea that Jesus offers hope. I was traveling with friends all the time who are wondering, okay, diagnosis of cancer, what does that mean? Loss of a loved one to tragedy, like car accidents, what does that mean? And this deep sense of loss and grief and almost protest at the way that things are is met in Jesus, where he points us forward to the idea that death is not a full stop. At least it doesn't have to be, because there is the opportunity for resurrection and eternal life. And this is this great moment where he's speaking to the sisters of Lazarus, and he says, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he die now, will live again. And these ones who live believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? And his promise to have life, the power to raise life from death, is backed up, supported by his own resurrection from the dead, the defeat of death itself in his resurrection on Easter Sunday. And this grand promise, then, this is like the evidential bedrock of Christianity, the resurrection of Jesus in history. And if he really rose, then that means death is not the final end. The experience of suffering we have here, in fact, the Apostle Paul in Romans 8 and 2 Corinthians 4, he begins contrasting the suffering of this life with what is yet to come. And 80 years of immense suffering, even still compared to eternity, is like drops in the bucket compared to the ocean. And in light of that, he says our present sufferings are not worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed when Christ comes again. And so Jesus offers hope that our grief will not ultimately swallow us, because it will be removed for those who hope in Christ. And that's profoundly animating to live different here and now, realizing that no matter what we sacrifice, that we're going to be met by God in eternity, where we will be compensated for the sufferings we go through, or in the language of Revelation 21:4, where Jesus will intimately wipe away the very tears from our eyes from this life. And that's a powerful image, a powerful hope that can animate us through suffering. And then you've got the death of Jesus. It was John Stott, the Anglican Bible teacher and theologian, who said, I don't know if I could have believed in God were it not for the cross. This is opening in the Cross of Christ in his chapter on suffering. And it's this idea that it's the death of Jesus on the cross where he experiences excruciating suffering, literally ex crucis from the cross in Latin, excruciating suffering. He is scourged, he's beaten and whipped and mocked. He is punched in the face. He's made to have a crown of thorns, the, I guess, symbol of the curse on creation, sort of put around his brow and pressed in, and he's then crucified. This excruciating torture that was masterminded by the Romans, and in light of this, that he would willingly go through that suffering. He didn't have to. He could have called legions of angels, but that he went through that suffering to pay for my sin and for yours shows us the depths of God's love for us. He didn't stay distant. He entered in to suffer with us and for us. He's touched by this world, and that in his resurrection body, he shows scars to his disciples. And like, these are profound pictures of the depths of God's love. And at least it's a challenge to us that if he's willing to go through this, our suffering cannot mean that God's absent or doesn't care, because he's shown his presence in the darkest moments in history by hanging on a cross and suffering and dying for us. He is there. He does care. Our suffering cannot mean that we're abandoned or unloved. He loves us, and something bigger is going on. And this is too where the Christian story offers meaning to our suffering. If the world is entirely random, indifferent, cold, godless, then our suffering is ultimately meaningless. It's bad cosmic luck. There's no rhyme or reason in it, to quote some secular thinkers. And yet the Christian story says, okay, if God's real, if he is as big as the Bible says, if God is able to take the worst suffering, namely the death of Jesus on the cross, this moment where the skies grow dark and creation cracks open, if this is what God can take a moment like that and turn that around to open a door of salvation to anyone who believes, if God can turn that darkness of Good Friday into a dawn of Easter Sunday, maybe, just maybe, he has ways of using our suffering beyond maybe what we can understand in the moment, beyond what we can even retrospectively look back and see the wisdom in allowing it to play out that way. God just maybe has ways of letting our suffering have meaning. And this is the picture that you see in places like 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 6, where even if for this present moment you have had to suffer trials of various kinds, these have come so that the testing of your faith, of greater worth than gold, this image of the testing of our faith, of gold purified through fire, of a forge, of smelting, of removal of impurities, of making something smaller in order to make it more pure. The Bible seems to give this dignity to our trial and our suffering, in that it can be a means by which God forges something more beautiful than before. He can shape our character and our courage, this kind of soul-making vision that we've been talking about. If God's big enough, that can be the reasons behind and the agency with which he does everything, so that we can affirm Romans 8:28, that for those who love God and are called according to his purposes, he works together all things for good. And so for me, it was these resources in the Gospels of seeing exactly what God is like in Jesus of Nazareth, a God who draws near and weeps, a God who offers profound hope, a God who steps in to bring an end to these symptoms of evil in the world and our suffering, a God who experiences them in his own body, a God who has scars, as Dostoevsky famously said, and ultimately a God who can redeem all of that suffering. I think this story of Jesus is the most helpful response. It's not an answer, it's a response. It's God's response to the real reality of evil and suffering in the world. It's not a why, it's a who. And it points us, if that's what God is like, even if we don't have all the answers, no matter how much we press in with our human reason to seek good ones, like what we've tried to give a sample of tonight and the various responses, that is the hope and meaning and resources of the Christian story. And if you really are suffering, running away from God, it does not get any better. But if you run towards him instead, if you wrestle with God in the midst of your suffering. And I promise there is something much more rich and meaningful and hopeful about the Christian story than anything else that I've found. Now, that doesn't make it true. That doesn't make Christianity true. That is why this is the problem of evil considered one of the key arguments against Christian theism or Christianity as a whole. But I do think I would much rather suffer with Jesus than suffer without him. And the resources that the Christian story offers in response to the problems of evil really are worth believing in. Now, I hope this has been really helpful to you. Obviously, we're been going for a long time, so if you're stuck around to the end, I just want to say thank you. I hope you've been able to draw various insights, both from our philosophy friends with Dan Woolnough and with Max Baker-Hytch. We'll have links to all of them in the show notes. You can check out their academic works and things that they've written, papers online. Please do, if that's helpful. As you've seen, we've covered a lot of different theodicies. I've tried to have sources in there so you can pick up on the different books or article ideas and go and track them down. But if you've got any other questions that you want to send in, we're going to keep doing these sorts of longer form teachings, I guess, where we're surveying different responses to major problems. We've done one on the reliability of the Gospels. We've done one on the problem of hell. This is the one on the problem of evil. And we've got plenty more coming up. So if you want to subscribe, like, share, we'd love to hear from you. Make sure you get in contact with our website, questioningchristianity.com. Actually, you can submit questions there. We're making video content all the time, shorter stuff on our YouTube, as well as this longer stuff as we get people on. So it's great to see you. Until next time, truth invites questioning. Thanks for joining.